Hi everyone and welcome to Chapter 8. This week we're going to be talking about performance monitoring. First off, before we get started, this video assumes that you have read Chapter 8 and you're also familiar with the different components of your computer. If you haven't already read Chapter 8, go ahead and do that first. So, now that you've read Chapter 8 hopefully, let's just delve right into it. So tonight what we're going to be talking about is Task Manager. Then we're going to move on to Performance Monitor, and then finally we're going to look at the Event Viewer. So first off, let's look at Task Manager, and that's what we're seeing right now. I'm going to go ahead and close this. There's a few different ways you can get to Task Manager. The first way is to just click Start and type Task Manager, and you'll see that there's an option that comes up that says View Running Processes with Task Manager. You can also get there by right-clicking the taskbar here and clicking Start Task Manager. And then finally, if you press Ctrl-Alt-Delete on your keyboard all at the same time, you have an option to start Task Manager. So we're going to start it. And what we're going to go over here is we're just going to cover what each one of these tabs does. So first off, we have the Applications tab. And the Applications tab has a few things to it, but mainly what this tab is used for is it's used to show you all of the different programs that are running on your computer at the moment and what the status of them is. So, for instance, you can see here that I have Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio running, and I have Notepad running. And typically, anything that shows up in this Applications tab, you can see in the taskbar as well. So you can see I've got SQL running, and I've got the Notepad document here, which has everything we have for this video in it. If you wanted to end a task, you could totally do that as well. All you have to do is select the task that you want to end and click End Task. You can also run a new task, so if you know the path to a task, for example MSTSC, which starts remote desktop, or like msconfig, you can do that and it will launch a new task for you. This is really useful to know. I've run into a couple cases where Windows Explorer doesn't start, so you can't actually do anything on the computer, but you can get to the Task Manager still by clicking or by pressing Ctrl-Alt-Delete on your keyboard and clicking Start Task Manager, and then you're able to launch Explorer from there. So that's just something really useful to know, I think, how to do. You can see here that you've also got a few options that shows you how many processes are running on your computer. It shows you the CPU usage and the physical memory usage. So that's pretty much the Applications tab. Next we're going to talk about the Processes tab. So processes are basically just little executables that are running on your machine that don't necessarily need to have user interfaces associated with them. They're almost like services, but they're not quite services. So this tab shows it shows all of the different executables that are running on your machine. A lot of these you'll see down in the system tray, right down here, and those will correspond to stuff that you'll see in here. For instance, LMI Guardian Service is a software program called LogMeIn, and we can see down here that it's running, and that's what this is right here, LogMeIn. So the first tab here, it tells you what the executable is that's running, or excuse me, the first column. The next column tells you which user is running it. Now that's really important if you have multiple user accounts logged into a machine. One thing that kind of corresponds with this column is the Show Processes from All Users. So when you launch Task Manager, by default it only shows you what you're running. But if you want to see what, let's say, the administrator account's running, if it's logged in, or maybe even you have your kid's account logged in and you notice your computer's performance is slow, you can click Show Processes from All Users and it will show everything that each user is running. And if you're an administrator, that allows you to manage the processes that are running on the machine and kill them if necessary. The next tab here tells you how much CPU usage each one of these tasks is using. You can see here that it flashed up 2 there for a second. That one flashed up 3. They're not always using CPU, but sometimes they will. The next tab over is how much memory each one of these tasks is using. This is a good gauge to see these two columns, to see what is eating up the performance on your machine. So if you sort the columns just by clicking the column header by name or CPU, you can really tell what the application is doing to your machine and what applications might be running away with all of your system resources. The final tab here is the description, and that just explains what each one of these things does. You also have the option down here on the right to end process, and it's the same as it was for the applications tab. You simply highlight the task that, or in this case process, that you wish to end, and you click end process. So that's pretty much the processes tab. The services tab, we talked about services a few weeks ago. This is really similar to what services.msc or the services snap-in looks like, except here in the name column you can see that it gives just the short name of the service. To be honest, I'm not sure why they give you the short name, because it makes it a lot harder to figure out what each one of these is. But on the other hand, you have the description here too, so you should, right here, so you should be able to tell. Honestly, I'd prefer it the other way around, but I guess that's Microsoft for you. So this tab functions really similarly to how the services.msc tab functions. In fact, if you click this, it's got a link to that services snap-in that you can launch right from the task manager. The only thing I think this gives you that the services snap-in doesn't is the PID, or the process ID. Sometimes when you right click and you select stop service or end service through the services menu, you'll run into a problem where it will have trouble killing the service, or it'll have it'll have trouble killing the service. And so you need the process ID, or the PID, from this screen here in order to kill that service via the command line. I'm not going to show you how to do that in this video because that's a topic for another day, but this is where you'd go to find the PID or process ID for that. This also gives you a brief overview of what's going on with each one of these services. So it tells you which services are running. If they're running, it'll say running, and if it's stopped, it'll say stopped. Alright, so the next tab here, this is the performance tab. So this is a real general view of the overall performance on your computer. So the CPU usage history here, this is just a graph that's showing how much processing power your computer is using over time. On the left here you can see the CPU usage at this point in time, and on the right here you can see the CPU usage history. Now this only saves a very small amount of history, and we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about how to add or how to capture more history here in just a bit. So this gives you a nice overview of what's going on. You can see here that I have two screens, or two CPU usage history graphs, and that's because I have a multi-core processor associated with this machine. The more cores you have, for example, some cores will have some processors will have 8 cores associated with them or more. You'll see a graph for each one of those cores here. Alright, so going down, you've also got the memory, and memory, same thing. You have a graph here that shows, or a bar graph here that shows your current memory usage, and then it shows you the physical memory usage history right here in this graph. So if an application is taking up a whole bunch of memory, you can kind of see memory usage spike up here. Same thing with CPU usage. If there's one that's taking up a whole bunch of memory, you'll probably see a CPU usage spike in this graph. Down here you've got kind of it's pretty much the same information that you're getting up here, except it's the raw numbers. So for example, physical memory, it shows you how much total memory you have, and this is in megabytes, MB. So I have about 3 gigs associated with this machine. It shows you how much memory is being cached, how much memory is available, and how much memory is free. It also shows you some kernel memory. This one's typically not super important. I mainly just look at the physical memory that's being used. Finally, this is just a brief overview of the machine. It's showing you the 2 most important steps, actually, I think, are uptime, which is how long the machine's been running for, and the number of processes that are running. Now, just a brief digression here. Uptime is really important to know for a couple of reasons. Mainly, what I've found is that when you ask people if they've rebooted their computer or not, or when was the last time they rebooted their computer, they don't know, or they might be, afraid to admit it. So you can go over here to this uptime tab and you can look and just see how long the machine's been running. And if the machine's been running for a really long time, sometimes it's a good idea just to give it a reboot. This also has the option to go to what's called Resource Monitor as well from this tab. So if we click this, you actually get a way more in-depth overview of what everything of what's running on your machine. So I'm not going to go over this one too much. Just know that this Resource Monitor tab is here. I highly encourage you to go through and play with this because it's a much more robust overview of what's going on with your machine at this point in time, or at a single point in time. Alright, so the next tab over, very similar to the previous one, this is the networking tab, and it shows you the network utilization. So just as proof of concept here, you can see here we have Bluetooth network connection and local area connection. It will actually show you a graph for each connection that you've got going on your machine. So since I only really have my network running over the local area connection, if we were to go look at a video online, we'd see network traffic spike up. So I'm just going to go do that as proof of concept here. And I'm a gamer, so I really like watching other people play games. So I'm going to go to twitch.tv. And this is just a video game streaming site. So we're gonna watch people play video games here. Or dance, one of the two of those. But you can see here that this video is playing. And corresponding to the video here, we also have a network spike. So this just tells you how much of your network is being used. Right now you can see it's not very much because the scale is telling you how much of the total bandwidth you're using on your network interface card. So in this case, because we launched that video, we were using about 2.5% of the available bandwidth on the network interface card. So that's basically just the networking tab. Finally, we have the users tab over here. Now Windows 7 has the ability to have multiple users logged in at the same time. Now unfortunately, unlike Linux, you can't use the machine actively for multiple user accounts. So for example, if you're trying to remote into a machine using Microsoft Remote Desktop, you won't be able to excuse me, you won't be able to use the machine and have the same person, or have someone who's sitting in front of the machine use it at the same time. But you can have each machine can have a different user account logged in at the same time. So for example, here you can see that my user account, tgreen, is logged in, and it's active, and I'm going through the console, which is just basically the sitting in front of it. That's what that describes. But if there was another user account logged in, you would see it show up here. Now the cool thing is, if we wanted to disconnect a user, we could just click disconnect, or if we wanted to log them off, we could click log off, and then they would lose their connection to the machine. So that's basically the task manager in a nutshell. We're going to go ahead and close out of this, and we are going to move on to Performance Monitor. So I mentioned that the task manager was kind of a good overall snapshot of your machine and how it's performing. But if you really wanted to get into the nitty-gritty, or you wanted to record historical data, you could do that through Performance Monitor. And to do that, all you have to do is go over here and type performance. If you could type. Sorry, I couldn't spell there for a second. You'll type performance, and then the first thing that comes up is Performance Monitor. You can also type perfmon, P-E-R-F-M-O-N, .exe, and it will come up as well. So Performance Monitor, there's a few things you can do with it. The two things I'm going to show you are the live monitoring features of it and the data collector sets. So first thing we want to do here, we're going to look at the live monitor. And I'm going to click Performance Monitor under Monitoring Tools. And this is going to show me, it's going to give me a graph. On the y-axis, we'll see 100%. And that's just the overall percentage of the component that you're using. And on the x-axis, you're going to see, the x-axis, you're going to see the time, or the overall time. So for instance, we'll see everything in this graph is captured between 6:38 p.m. and 6:40 p.m. Now, what this graph here is showing you is it's showing you a counter of percent processor time. Now, Windows, as you'll see here in just a second, actually allows you to monitor a whole bunch of different aspects of a machine. In fact, there's several thousand different metrics you can use to measure the performance of a machine. So we're going to look at just a few of the important ones. As you might imagine, some of them are more important than others. So let's say we wanted to monitor something else, like the memory, for example. So all we have to do is down here in the bottom right here where you see the metric percent processor time, or the counter percent processor time, we're going to right click and we're going to say add counter. So once we click add counters, you can see here that we have a whole bunch of categories that are available to us. So you can see here we can measure .NET information, we can measure database information, we can measure event viewer, we can measure a bunch of different protocols like IP or ICMP. We can measure memory, we can measure disk, but like I said, not all of these are things that you care about, and that's why you don't simply just have all of them. And again, there's thousands, so it might be a little bit difficult to measure. So we're going to go to memory, and let's say that we have a computer and we notice that it has high disk activity. Well, one of the things that you can do with a machine is you can set it up so that the computer's hard disk actually will function as memory, and if the memory fills up on a machine, or the RAM fills up on a machine, it will start doing what's called paging. And paging basically just moves tasks on the memory out to the slower storage on the hard drive. So let's say the real issue with that, though, is that because the hard drive is typically slower, you'll run into some performance issues, or that will create a performance bottleneck if it's pushing too much information out to the hard drive, because to retrieve that, it's got to go through two components, the memory and the hard drive, rather than just one, the memory. So let's say you notice a computer is really slow, the hard drive sounds like it's acting up, you're having a hard time retrieving your data. Well, let's one of the metrics we can use to measure that is pages/second, and this is telling us how many pages per second it's processing. Now here's another really kind of hokey thing, and I hate to use that term, but that's exactly what it is. If you click this, you'd think that there would be a sort of a description of the problem, or not, excuse me, a description of the of what the counter or the metric here you're using is. Well, Microsoft in their infinite wisdom has decided that it wasn't important enough to show initially, so you have to click this show description button in order to receive a description of what you're actually adding here. So you can see here that the pages per second is the rate at which pages are read from or written to the hard disk page file. So if we wanted to add this, we're going to click this. We're going to click the metric we want to add. Then we're going to just simply click add. And that's going to add this performance counter to the added counters of this, this window here that we see behind us. So we're just going to click OK. Oh, did I mess up? No, I didn't. I just needed to scroll down. Sorry about that. So now we can see we have a metric for percent processor time and pages per second. Now, this graph is kind of difficult to read, mainly because the two line items that we're measuring are both exactly the same color. So what we can do is we can actually just change the color by double-clicking the color option here. And we've got a few other options that we can look at too, but we're just going to change the color for now. So I'm going to click blue, and we'll click OK. And now we can see here, you can see it very faintly on the bottom, but there's a blue icon, or a blue line that's running across the bottom. And unfortunately for us, there's not a lot of paging activity. Oh, right there, we can see that it spiked a little bit. But now we can see we've got two graphs. So now one thing to keep in mind is the scale of the graph that you're using. So the scale of the percent processor time might be different than the pages per second. So you need to keep in mind what numbers you're measuring. So in this case, because percentage processor time is a percentage and pages per second is an actual number, it might not make sense to have them both on the same graph. So what we're going to do is we're going to just uncheck processor time, and now we can see here that the graph is basically just showing us the pages per second. Now there's a couple other things that you can do with this graph. Namely, if we right click the counter and select properties, we've got a few tabs here that are available to us. First off, we can display like legend elements. For example, we can display the legend, the value bar, the toolbar. You can play with those if you want. We can show in the different views, which I'm going to show you next, we can show you a few different pieces of information. You can tell it how often you want to sample. So for example, if you want to sample or take a sample every 1 second, which is what it's set to by default, you can do that. If you want to change the duration of this graph, so you can see here that once it gets to the end it repeats, you can do that as well. And just to show you what that means, we're going to change that. We'll change it to 10 and then we'll hit OK. And you can see here that there's much less of a graph, or much less data points shown on this graph because it's going across the screen much faster. In fact, it only takes about 10 seconds to go across the screen. So we've got some other information here that we can look at. We're going to skip source for now. One thing I really want to point out is if you're going to be recording this information, as you'll see here in just a few minutes, you might play with the amount of time or amount of samples that you take. It might not be important to take 1 sample a second. In fact, for some things, it might just be worth it to take a sample every 5 minutes or every 10 minutes, or maybe even quicker than that, every 0.5 seconds. It all depends on what you're trying to measure, so keep that in mind when you're setting these up. So the graph here, we can also change it, change the view. So we've got histogram view, report view, and histogram bar, report view, and line view. And we're going to see what each one of those are here in a second. You can also change the title of the graph. So I'm going to call this test graph. And you can change the vertical axis to whatever you want. So for example, we said pages per second, so I'm going to say number of pages. You can also add a grid as well, a vertical and a horizontal grid. And we're going to click OK. And you can change, and you can change the vertical scale too. So if you're measuring a metric that maybe has more than 100 as its top or maximum point of the scale, you might change that. But by default it's 100 and the minimum is 0. So we're going to click OK. And you can see here that it's changed this graph a little bit for us. Yeah, so now we've added the number of pages, we've added a title to it, and we've changed the color of what we were looking at before. We've also changed the speed as well. So that is essentially just the live view. There's another, like I mentioned before, there's another thing you can do. If you want to change this to, we'll go ahead and we will change the view to a histogram bar. We can do that as well. Now a histogram bar is basically just a bar graph or a column graph that you're going to look at. And they give you this view because some data is actually better viewed in different types of graphs. So for example, it might not make sense for us to do a number of pages count via a bar graph. Maybe we don't care about it over time, we just care about it at a single point in time. So we might do just a bar graph rather than a line graph. The other thing we can do is we can look at a report or report view. So if we just want to look at this and we want to look at it as it's happening, we can just change it to a report view and we can get just the raw numbers. So some people, rather than looking at pictures like or rather than looking at pictures to describe data, they prefer report views like this. So this might be a good thing to maybe give to a manager or something like that, something to just make it really easy for them to understand. So basically this, in other words, this performance monitor tool here gives you a few options. So that is the performance monitor. So excuse me, not the performance monitor, that's the live view. So this is really useful, again, if you're looking at maybe just a specific point in time, or you only need to look at it for a little bit. But let's say you need to capture this data, and you need to you need a historical data, or you need to have historical capture of this data, so that you can present it to people at will, rather than just giving them this tool and saying, hey, you need to look at this, or you need to see what this is at this point in time. Let's say, for example, let's say a manager comes up to you and says, I need to know the CPU usage over the last 5 days. So what you can do is you can come in here and you can create what's called a data collector set. Now, don't let that sound, that sounds kind of intimidating, but really what it is it's just capturing the data that we've looked at in here over time, and then we can manipulate it later to create reports. So if we wanted to create a new data collector set, all we have to do is simply click user defined, right click it, and then select new, and then data collector set. Here you can name your data collector set, so I'm going to call it demo data. And then you've got a few options available to you. You can create it for a template, or you can create it manually. Since I usually like to monitor things individually, I'm just going to go ahead and create it manually. So then it asks you if you want to create data logs for performance counters, event trace data, or system configuration information. So performance counters are what we were looking at before. They're they'll typically be a percentage or a number. It's just something that we can count. Event trace data is event information, and we're going to look at the event logs here in a second. But basically, when something changes on your machine and it's logged to the event log, you can monitor that with Performance Monitor. You can also collect information about the system configuration information. So for example, if like the network interface card changes, or you plug in a USB drive, you can monitor that as well with this performance monitoring tool. But since we want to monitor performance data of the actual machine we're working with, we're going to click Performance Counter. Then I'm going to click Next, and then here we can select which performance counters we want to add. So we're going to click Add, and it's the exact same interface we were looking at before. So we're going to go back up to memory. Excuse me. There we go. We're going to type memory, or we're going to go to memory here, and we were going to look at exactly what we wanted to look at before, which was pages per second. Then we're going to click Add, and we'll click OK. Now, the cool thing here, just to show you what you can do, is you can add any number of these. So if we wanted to monitor page faults per second, page reads per second, page writes per second, and input output per second, we could totally do that. You can shift click these and just click Add. And just for the purposes of this video, we're going to add all of them. So we'll click OK. And then here you can change your sample interval. So over 5 days, taking a sample interval at 15 seconds, you might imagine that's a lot of data to look at. You might not necessarily need to do it every 15 seconds, but this is where you would go to change it. So we're going to leave it at that by default. And then we'll click Next. And now this is going to ask you where you want to save this, save the data to. This is what it's going to collect. It's the data collection file. What we're going to do is we're just going to select it and we're going to put it on the desktop. So we're going to go Users, T-Green, Desktop. We'll click OK. Then we'll click Next. This is going to ask you who you want to run it as. Some programs or some data collection requires you to have administrator privileges, but this one does not, so we're just going to leave it as save and close. But if you need to change it, you can change it through here, and you can run this data collector set as the user you want to collect the data with. So we'll click Finish, and now we have a new data collector set called Data Demo, or excuse me, Demo Data. So if we want to run this data collector set, we'll just click Start. And you can see that right now it's going through and it's collecting all of that data, all of that information. So we'll give it a second here just so it gets some information. And we said it was every 15 seconds or so. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to stop it. It should have collected one, maybe two pieces of information. I should have actually set that to be a little bit quicker, but that's okay. So we're going to click stop. And that will stop the data collector set. So if we wanted to go and view the report that we just created, or view the report of the data that we just captured, we'll just click start reports, and then we'll find user defined, and you can see here that it's created a folder called demo data, which corresponds to this data collector set that we created. Then we're just going to double click it, and you can see here that it's going to just show us the historical information for the data collector set that we just ran. So for instance, we can just click here and we can see at a point in time what the data was like. So we had basically just two samples that were taken throughout this 30-second period. We had one here, and then we had one here, and it just connected the dots for us. So that's something that's just really useful to know and understand. You're in your lab, you're going to be going through and you're going to be creating one of these, and then you're going to be using it to gauge the performance of your computer, and then recommend upgrades or possible upgrades to your computer based upon this information. So this is really handy if someone comes to you and says, hey, my computer is running really slow. What can you do to fix it? You can take a performance monitor, or you can create a data collector set and take a performance monitor of their machine, and you can see kind of where their machine is failing, what performance or what components are causing bottlenecks. And then you can really use that data to give them a solid recommendation. And since this is a report, and you can change how it looks, so you could do like a histogram bar view, or you could do a report, you could actually give them the solid information too and say, hey, this is what you should be at, and this is what you're actually at. So this is the component that you need to upgrade. So that is the performance monitor in a nutshell. We looked at the live data collection. We also looked at how to create a data collector set and use that to collect data on your machine. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to close that, and we're going to really quickly move on to the event viewer. So let's go ahead, we're just going to go to start, and like most things, we'll just type event viewer. Sorry, bear with me for a sec. I'm just going to type event, but you could type event viewer and you could just get there. You can see it's the first thing that pops up. You can also get there by going computer, right click it, or clicking start, computer, then clicking manage. And then from there you have the event viewer. So the event viewer is exactly like it sounds. It basically is just a collection of files or log files that are specific to Windows and sometimes other applications. So there's we're going to look at the raw event viewer first. So I'm going to close this one. So you can see here that in the Windows logs folder, this is kind of where you got a couple let me back up. There's a couple folders available to you. You've got the Windows logs folder, you've got custom views, and you have application and service logs. The one that's really important is the Windows log folder. And if we drop this down, you can see here that you've got a couple other log files that are associated with this. You have application, you've got security, you've got setup, you've got system, and you've got forwarded events. So let's just go through them one by one. Application, the application log is basically where different applications will go and they will write information to them. So for example, you can see here that we have a log file entry that was taken at 6:44 p.m. and the source of it was the Office Software Protection Platform, which is part of Office. And this is basically just telling you what it did. So down here in the General tab, we can see that it's that the client has sent activation request to the Key Management Services machine. Sometimes this log file information isn't really relevant to what you need. You can see here that there's a whole bunch of log files that have been written, or logs that have been written. The system tries to keep track of almost everything that you do or everything that happens on your machine, so that in the event that something does happen, you can go back and you can look at the log and you can say, hey, this happened on this date, and then you can troubleshoot further from there. So the log file has it has some different information here that's associated with it. You can see here that there's kind of different levels of logs, and we're going to look at that here in just a second. But that was basically the event log here. Let me back up. So you have a column here for level. We're going to talk about the different levels of log files that you've got available to you. It tells you the date and time that something was logged. So for example, this Outlook here, it cataloged a checkpoint, or it detected a catalog checkpoint for this offline file here at 3/3/2015 at 3:58 p.m. Again, maybe not relevant, but it's good to have just in case you need it. The source here, this will tell you what actually logged the event log entry. So you can see that Office logged this, Outlook logged this, GP Update logged this, and so on and so forth. So that's basically the source. Then you have another column for event ID. Sometimes these event IDs are useful, especially when you're receiving an error message or an error in your log file. We're going to look at the errors here in a second. And specifically what you'll do is you'll take that event ID, and then you can just go to Google and you can type the event ID in there, and you can get more information about that. So sometimes, like as you can see here, the log file isn't really that easy to understand in some cases. So the event ID allows you to go to websites on the internet that will further explain what the issue is, or why this event ID was created. So that's the application log. You've also got the security log. So this is where you, some of you have seen this before, but this is where you would go to check and see certain information about different security aspects on your machine. So here you can see we have auditing set up, and we've already looked through auditing a little bit in a past lab. But this is where you would go to look at all of the audit requests that have been made. So if let's say you've set up auditing for a folder and a user tried to connect to it and they weren't supposed to, you'd be able to go back here in the security log and see where the audit had failed or where that user had tried to log in. Very similar set of columns here to the previous log file that we looked at. You've got the audit log, or the keywords that you're looking for in here in the first column. You have date and time, which tells you when that event occurred. You have the source of the audit file. Mainly you'll just see Windows or Microsoft Windows security auditing here. You've got the event ID, so what caused that file to be generated. And then you've got the task category, which tells you a little bit more information about the log. So that's the security log in a nutshell. There's a whole bunch of different things that are going to get logged by default, but one of the most useful things I think is file and folder logging and auditing. And this is where you would go to retrieve that information. The setup log here, this basically just explains like packages or software that gets installed on your machine. In other words, when you set something up, this is where it gets logged to. Next on, we have the system, and this is where I find myself going the most, the system and the application log. The system log will tell you, for example, if your computer blue screens of death, you'll find the log for that in here. And we're going to go through and we're going to see if we can't find something other than information. Yeah, there we go. Let's scroll back up here. So you can see here that in the level we have error and we have warning. So the information here is just an FYI type thing, but the more important ones are errors and warnings. These are the ones you need to look out for. So if a program or an application or something on your system was causing a problem, it would get logged with the level of warning or error, and then allow you to draw attention to it, or it basically tries you to draw attention to it so that you can figure out what the problem was. So here we can see that I had a warning, and basically this is telling me, hey, something didn't work, but it's not really critical to the function of your machine. The error, on the other hand, tells you, hey, this is actually causing something to completely malfunction on your machine, and it's something you should look at. Now, sometimes errors and warnings, depending on what it's talking about, mean different things. So for example here, this is the browser service has failed to retrieve the backup too many times. And despite the fact that it's an error message, I don't feel too bad about that, because that was something that happened in the background. And it didn't affect me using my computer in any way. But if I did notice my machine malfunctioning, or I was getting a lot of blue screens, or I don't know, it was turning off and on again just by itself, then I'd come here and I'd look in the system log, and I would try to find out if there were any errors that were logged that showed, excuse me, that showed problems that I was having. So forwarded events. So you'll notice that there's nothing in here, and it actually says that it's disabled. So I mentioned in a previous lecture that you can actually log the events of other machines. You can do that with the event viewer here. So if you need to log like a server, for example, or if you need to log another client machine, you can do from your machine, you can do that, but it will show up in forwarded events rather than on their event log. So it basically prevents you from having to go to their machine to capture all of that data. It will just show up in forwarded events. So in other words, the four most important ones are application security, setup, and system. Some other applications might write their log files in this folder here, applications and services log, but 9 times out of 10 you'll find things pull up in application security or system more often than not. So that's basically the event viewer. Oh, one thing I do want to show you with the event viewer, I had mentioned we have like thousands of different logs. Log files that we look at. I think this one has 52,000 events to look at. As you might imagine, it's really difficult to have to sift through these. So if you want to filter the log and just try to find exactly what you need, you can do that using these tools here. So for example, filter current log, we could click that. It'll pull up this filter option, and then we could narrow our search down from there. So if we wanted to look at just the errors that had, or excuse me, just the events that had occurred within the last 24 hours, we could do that. If we want to narrow it down further by event level, we could do error, critical, and warning. You can type the event sources in here, so if you notice a particular application that's causing problems or a particular event source that's causing issues, you can look through here. Stop it. I scrolled down too far, sorry about that. If you have a particular event ID that's causing problems, and that's what you're seeing here, or if you see a particular event ID that's occurring along with a problem on your machine, you can search by that. You can search by keywords, and then you can search by users or computers too. So we're going to just click OK. And now we can see that we've really narrowed it down. We've narrowed it down to a list that actually fits on a single page. So lots of time service warnings, DNS warnings. And again, these aren't necessarily bad. It's just something that you should be aware of here. So that's how to filter events. And that is pretty much the event log. I'm going to go ahead and cancel that. Sorry about that. That's pretty much the event log. That's basically what I look for when I go through and try to search for, issues that I was having with my machine. And I try to go use the event log as a starting point for troubleshooting. It usually gives a pretty good indication of the software that's going wrong or what's going wrong with the machine. Sometimes it's not so helpful though, and you'll have to take that event ID and then you have to put it into Google and you'll have to see if anyone else has had your problem. But that is the event viewer in a nutshell here, really quick. So just to recap, we talked about the task manager and how it gives a really good brief overview or general overview of the machine as it's functioning. We talked about the performance monitor and how you can use that to, kind of as a pseudo live monitor to monitor different metrics on your machine. We also talked about how to create historical data collections and reports using data collector sets. And finally, we took a look at the event viewer. So as always, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, please post them to discussion boards. If you don't get a response there within 24 hours, I'd recommend just emailing me, and then we can go from there. Have a fantastic week, and I will see you next time.